Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving headfirst into a really pivotal and honestly quite a jarring period in American history, Grover Cleveland's second presidency. That's 1893 to 1897.
Yeah, and what's really distinctive about this period is, of course, he's the only president to serve two non-consecutive terms. So that gap, it gives his second time in office a really unique context, almost like a sequel, where the world's changed around him.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, we're really putting a laser focus on what just completely defined those 4 years, that brutal economic depression, the Panic of 1893.
Yeah.
We've got a great set of sources here that really bring the domestic struggles of that era to life.
They really do.
So the central question we're kind of tackling is this. How did this devastating economic collapse, how did it ripple across the nation? And what were the most critical challenges that just landed squarely in Cleveland's lap?
Okay, let's unpack this. Well, the timing was almost Shakespearean, really. Cleveland takes office March 1893, and almost immediately the economic foundations just started to crumble. A key early event was the failure of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad. Very dramatic.
Wow, a major railway collapsing. I must have sent some serious alarm bells ringing right away. But it wasn't just like an isolated thing, was it? There were deeper problems going on.
Exactly. It was a confluence of factors that created this really damaging economic storm. You had European credit markets already pretty fragile, partly because of a big financial crisis in Argentina and the near failure of Barings Bank over in London.
Okay.
So that prompted European investors to start pulling their capital out of the U.S. Then domestically, the U.S. had a poor cotton harvest in '92, which, hurt exports. And crucially, there wasn't a central banking system here. So the federal government had very few tools, really, to manage the money supply.
Right, a lot of vulnerabilities just waiting. And then you mentioned something about a big run on the banks.
Yes. Starting around May of '93, a major bank run just further drained the financial system of, well, essential cash. And it's worth remembering the previous administration, Harrison's, had largely sort of downplayed any economic worries.
Yeah.
So this full-blown crisis, like our sources say, it really just landed at Cleveland's feet right when he started term 2.
Thrown right into the fire then. Now, one issue that keeps popping up in our material is this whole silver question. What exactly was Cleveland's view on that, and how did it connect to the economic mess?
Oh, this was absolutely central. Cleveland was a very firm believer in the gold standard. He argued that bimetallism, backing currency with both silver and gold, was actually harmful.
Harmful? How so?
Well, his thinking was it led people to hoard gold because they feared silver would devalue the currency. And it also made European investors really hesitant about investing in the U.S. because they saw the dollar as potentially unstable. It wasn't just about the immediate crisis. Cleveland and his allies, they saw gold as providing essential discipline, good for long-term economic health, international standing.
Right.
Which, of course, was the total opposite view from, say, farmers who wanted silver to ease their debts.
Okay, so he was definitely in the sound money camp. And where did that Sherman Silver Purchase Act fit into all this?
Right, the Sherman Act. That was passed back in 1890 under Harrison. It basically forced the Treasury to buy a lot of silver every month, 4.5 million ounces for coinage.
Wow.
Cleveland was convinced this act was just artificially inflating the money supply, undermining the dollar's value, and really hurting creditors. And what's fascinating is, on this issue, he was directly opposing a big chunk of his own Democratic Party, especially folks in the South and West who loved silver.
Yeah.
They saw it as a way to boost the economy.
Sounds like he was willing to take a pretty big political risk then. So what did he actually do about the Sherman Act?
He made repealing it his absolute top priority. Right away, he called a special session of Congress, August '93, specifically just to deal with this. He personally lobbied senators hard to get the votes for repeal, even though it caused huge divisions in his party.
Contentious, I bet.
Oh, incredibly contentious debates in both the House and the Senate. But eventually the act was repealed. It took a coalition, though Democrats who agreed with him, plus some Republicans from the East.
So a political win for Cleveland, technically. But did it actually, fix the economy? Did it stop the crisis?
Well, that's the thing. Surprisingly, no. Contrary to what the administration hoped, repealing the Sherman Act didn't magically restore investor confidence. The Treasury's gold reserves just kept dwindling, maybe a bit slower, but still falling.
Oh, dear.
This forced the government to start issuing bonds to try and get more gold. And this is where it gets really interesting and politically tricky for Cleveland. He had to turn to really powerful figures like the investment banker J.P. Morgan to help float these bond issues.
Ah, okay. So he's getting criticized for cozying up to Wall Street right when lots of people felt the big banks were part of the problem.
Exactly that. He got hammered for relying on these Wall Street giants instead of, doing something more direct for ordinary people suffering in the Depression. But Cleveland, he felt he really had no other choice to stop the government from defaulting.
And the scale of this depression, it was just immense, wasn't it? Not just banks and railroads.
Oh, the numbers are just grim. Hundreds and hundreds of banks failed, businesses collapsed. By 1895, something like 25% of all the railroads were in receivership. Basically bankrupt and court-controlled.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, and unemployment rates just soared. Over 20% in many industrial areas. And if you did have a job, chances are you faced serious wage cuts. Government income, tax revenues, they just plummeted too.
With that kind of hardship, almost inevitable you'd see major social unrest. Our sources talk about things like Coxey's army. Tell us about that.
Yeah, Coxey's army was a really powerful symbol of just how desperate people were. Jacob Coxey, this guy from Ohio, he organized a march of unemployed workers to Washington, D.C.
What were they asking for?
They had two main demands: create public works projects, government jobs, basically, and switch to bimetallism, which they thought would help farmers pay off debts. Thousands joined the march along the way, but only about 500 actually made it all the way to Washington.
So more symbolic than actually changing policy.
Pretty much. It didn't directly lead to the policies Coxey wanted. Cleveland was definitely not keen on direct government relief programs like that. But it starkly highlighted the growing public demand for the government to do something. It really showed the deep anger, especially out west, about the monetary policies favored back east.
And then things escalated even more with the Pullman Strike, right? That sounds like a huge confrontation.
Oh, the Pullman Strike of 1894 was massive, hugely disruptive. Basically, railroad companies cut wages because of the Depression. The American Railway Union, the ARU, led by Eugene V. Debs, they organized strikes.
Okay.
Initially against a couple of railroads, but then it blew up when the Pullman Company, they made the railroad cars, refused to negotiate after laying off tons of workers. So the ARU called a boycott. Workers refused to handle any train with Pullman cars on it.
Which would basically paralyze the whole system.
Exactly. National rail commerce just ground to a halt. By June 94, you had something like 125,000 railroad workers out on strike.
Wow. That's an enormous disruption for the whole country. How did Cleveland handle that?
Cleveland's response was very decisive and very controversial. He got a federal injunction against the strikers, arguing they were blocking the mail and interstate commerce.
Okay.
When the strikers ignored the injunction, Cleveland sent federal troops into Chicago and other big rail hubs. This was even though the governor of Illinois, John Altgeld, strongly objected. He said it was federal overreach, stepping on states' rights.
But Cleveland went ahead anyway. What was his justification?
Yeah, he did. His argument was, look, the mail has to get through, and some of these railroads were already under federal receivership because they were bankrupt. So he argued that justified federal intervention.
Right. So he put federal power in keeping commerce flowing above, well, the state's objections and the strikers' demands.
Yeah.
How did people react to that?
Well, initially, a lot of the big newspapers and business leaders, they supported Cleveland's actions, but organized labor felt completely betrayed. Alienated. They saw it as the government just flat out siding with big business against workers. The Supreme Court later backed Cleveland up, actually. In a case called In Re Debs, they said the president could intervene in labor disputes that messed with interstate commerce. But yeah, the perception that Cleveland was in bed with big business, that really stuck after Pullman.
Man, it really feels like his second term was just one major fight after another. Economic policy, labor. And then there was the old tariff issue.
Yeah.
Democrats had always wanted lower tariffs, hadn't they?
Yeah, tariff reduction was like a core Democratic promise. They felt they had a mandate after the '92 election. The argument was the high McKinley tariff just made everything too expensive for consumers. So Representative William L. Wilson, working with Cleveland's team, introduced a bill.
What did it propose?
Moderate cuts, mainly on raw materials. But to make up for the lost government money, the bill included something new. A 2% income tax on incomes over $4,000, which was, a lot of money back then.
An income tax, that's a pretty big deal. Trying to shift the tax burden a bit.
Exactly. Supporters saw it as a way to make things fairer, make the wealthy pay a bigger share. Now, people like Wilson, even Cleveland himself, were maybe a bit iffy on the income tax part. But it got put in mainly because influential Democrats like William Jennings Bryan and Benton McMillan really pushed for it, and it actually passed the House.
But I seem to remember it hit a wall in the Senate.
Oh, it certainly did. Senate Democrats, especially guys like Arthur Pugh Gorman from Maryland, started pushing for more protection for industries in their states. The bill got totally reworked in the Senate. Over 600 amendments were tacked on.
600, wow.
Yeah, and they basically gutted the original reform ideas. Special interests, especially the infamous Sugar Trust, lobbied like crazy and got changes that helped them. Interestingly, the income tax part actually stayed in the Senate version.
Why was that?
Well, partly because some conservatives figured, okay, let's leave it in. The Supreme Court will probably just strike it down anyway.
Sneaky. So what was the final outcome then?
Well, the Senate passed its version, heavily amended.
Right.
The House eventually, very reluctantly, agreed to it. The final Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act, it did lower average tariff rates a bit, maybe from 49% down to about 42%. But it was nothing like the big reform Cleveland wanted.
How did Cleveland react?
He was apparently furious. He denounced the final bill, said it was basically written by the trusts they were supposed to be fighting. But in the end, he let it become law without his signature. Figured it was still slightly better than the old McKinley tariff.
And the income tax.
Just like some predicted, the Supreme Court struck it down in 1895, the Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust case. So, boom. A key part of their plan to deal with the revenue loss was just gone.
So a major frustration on tariffs. Now let's shift gears to another really critical area. Civil rights. What was Cleveland's record like there in this second term?
Yeah, on civil rights. Well, Cleveland's actions, his stances, they pretty much reflected the views of many white Southerners at the time. He'd actively campaigned against the Lodge Bill, which was meant to strengthen federal protection for black voting rights.
Okay.
Then, once in office, he signed the repeal of the Enforcement Act of 1871. That act had allowed for federal oversight of elections, trying to prevent fraud and intimidation.
So he rolled back federal protections.
Essentially, yes. And maybe most importantly, most consequentially, he basically gave his nod of approval to the Supreme Court's decision in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896.
The separate but equal case.
Exactly. That decision, which Cleveland seemed fine with, became the legal bedrock for expanding Jim Crow segregation laws and the massive disenfranchisement of African Americans across the South.
So it sounds like his administration pretty much just deferred to the southern states on these really fundamental issues and actively opposed federal efforts to protect black voting rights.
That's a fair summary, unfortunately. Our sources make it pretty clear he shared the reluctance of many white Southerners to treat African Americans as, social or political equals. He didn't think the federal government should get involved in what he saw as basically a state social issue.
Gosh, all this massive turmoil, the economic collapse, the strikes, these policy battles, the civil rights situation, it must have just completely reshaped the political landscape. What happened in the 1894 midterm elections?
Oh, the 94 midterms were an absolute disaster for the Democrats, just catastrophic. Public anger over the Depression was so high, it led to a massive Republican landslide.
They took back Congress.
Big time. Republicans won control of the House by a huge margin. Democrats lost seats pretty much everywhere except the South, where they kind of held on against the populist movement. And even within the Democratic Party, Cleveland's critics gained a lot more power.
So he's facing a hostile Congress for his last 2 years.
Exactly. For the last 2 years, Cleveland had a Republican Congress, and the Democrats still in Congress were mostly Southern agrarians who weren't exactly his biggest fans anyway. It really marked a major voter realignment.
It painted a picture of a president just increasingly isolated, facing opposition from, well, pretty much everywhere. We've focused mostly on domestic stuff, but our sources touched briefly on foreign policy too. What were the main things happening there?
Right, foreign policy. Two main issues kind of stand out. First, the whole question of annexing Hawaii came up again. Cleveland initially was against it. He even launched an investigation into how the Hawaiian monarchy got overthrown. But in the end, his administration did officially recognize the Republic of Hawaii.
Okay.
What else? The other big one was the Venezuela boundary dispute with Great Britain. Cleveland really asserted the Monroe Doctrine quite forcefully there, insisted the U.S. had a major interest, and that eventually pushed Britain to agree to international arbitration to settle the border. He also kept the U.S. neutral in the Cuban War of Independence that was heating up.
And military policy, anything significant there?
Yeah, the push to modernize the Navy and strengthen coastal defenses, which had started in his first term, that actually continued. So ordering new battleships, torpedo boats, that kind of thing kept going.
Now, going back to the challenges Cleveland faced here at home, it wasn't just Congress and the economy. Even getting his Supreme Court picks confirmed was tough, wasn't it?
Yeah, he ran into serious headwinds in the Senate with his Supreme Court nominations. Two of his picks, William Hornblower and Wheeler Peckham, were actually rejected.
Really? Why?
Mostly due to opposition from a powerful senator, David B. Hill, and also because Cleveland apparently didn't do enough consulting with key senators beforehand. He did eventually get two confirmed, though: Edward Douglas White and Rufus Wheeler Peckham.
Okay. Amidst all this difficulty, were there any sort of positive developments? Our sources mentioned Utah joining the Union.
That's right. Kind of a bright spot amidst the gloom.
Yeah.
Utah officially became the 45th state during Cleveland's second term on January 4th, 1896. So yeah, a moment of national expansion happening alongside all the other struggles.
A little bit of progress there.
Yeah.
But as his second term was winding down, what was the overall political mood like? Especially thinking about the big election coming up in 1896.
Well, by 96, Cleveland was deeply unpopular, hugely unpopular, even within his own Democratic Party. The party basically repudiated him and his policies. They rejected his defense of the gold standard and nominated William Jennings Bryan, who was, the fiery champion of free silver.
So the party went in a totally different direction.
Completely. Cleveland, he didn't openly endorse anyone, but apparently he was kind of sympathetic to a third-party ticket, the Gold Democrats. They got hardly any votes, though. The Republican, William McKinley, won the election.
How did Cleveland feel about that?
Interestingly, Cleveland apparently felt some personal satisfaction. He saw McKinley's win as a kind of vindication for his own long, hard fight for the gold standard.
It really is a complex picture of the man, isn't it?
Yeah.
Often seems quite contradictory. What's his overall historical reputation look like today?
It's definitely evolved. He left office with, more recently, historians offer a more, let's say, nuanced view, sometimes more critical. But many still credit him with really reasserting presidential power. His ranking among historians has definitely bounced around over the years, reflecting all these different interpretations.
Yeah, a legacy that's still debated.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this has been a deeply fascinating and, sometimes pretty sobering deep dive into a really transformative time in American history. It's just so clear that the economic depression of the 1890s cast this incredibly long shadow over Cleveland's second presidency. It fundamentally shaped everything, didn't it? From economic policy fights to labor relations, even the tragic path of civil rights.
Absolutely. The sheer scale of the challenges and how interconnected they were, the devastating economy, the widespread, often violent labor unrest, those incredibly divisive tariff debates, and the profoundly troubling issues around civil rights, it really pushed the nation's resilience and the perceived limits of what government could or should do back then.
It really gives you pause, doesn't it? Think about the echoes between the economic and social challenges of Cleveland's time and maybe some of the complex issues we grapple with today. What lessons might we draw from that really tumultuous period about, say, leadership in a crisis, or the right role for government intervention in the economy, in society, and just the enduring capacity and sometimes the tragic failures of a society to adapt to fundamental upheaval? It's certainly a lot to think about. Thank you for joining me for this deep dive.